All right, anti-inflammatory drugs are our first class, and mainly because we deal with inflammation. And inflammation is actually a good thing. We need it for the body to start its healing process and to start that process going through. But what we don't want is it to get out of control and have too much inflammation that either leads to some bad outcomes or just delays the healing process itself, getting out of that, especially that acute stage that we go through. This is chapter 6 as we go through, and I'll start all of these from now on with at least a slide or two of just some basic terminology that I want you to be aware of. Some of this stuff you've already come in contact with or been exposed to, like chemotaxis and cytokines and neutrophils. These down here, you may have been come in contact, but this is, some of them will be terminology that you'll see within the text or within these video lectures. I know this slide here, there's a lot of these that you have heard before. Maybe some of them that you heard before and you can't remember it right now. That's fine. But I do think I'm not going to ask you these specifically, like what is ischemia, but I'll talk about ischemia, and I think it would just be helpful to know that what ischemia is as a lack of low blood flow leading to a lack of oxygen, which is going to be hypoxic situation kind of thing. All right, so as we move on, this is one of my favorite signs that I like to put on there and read that. But the book, chapter 6, starts off with a kind of a brief review of the inflammatory process, specifically with the chemical mediators and cellular components that are producing the chemical mediators, mainly because this is where our drugs are going to intervene in that process. It's going to, that's where we can have the most effect from a pharmacological standpoint. I always like my analogies of some kind of natural disaster, catastrophe, accident kind of thing, because the response of the emergent, personnel and the construction workers and everybody that comes to clean it up, very similar to what goes on within the body. You have this big area of injury, and then you have this inflammatory process that comes in to kind of repair this, clean it up. It's not pretty, it's not clean. Sometimes, especially like in this situation right here, it may take a long time, and it may cause other associated damage as we start to scrape up this dirt off the highway, and we have to repair the highway a little bit more. So yeah, it's a good analogy for the injury process itself. On page 113 in your text, what is that, figure 6-1 has the kind of diagram taking you through the inflammation process as a review. And just briefly, this is kind of the highlights that I want you to remember and recall and think back on. That acute response to initial injury, vasoconstriction, all those chemical mediators that come out. This one right here we haven't talked about as much, but I just want you to recognize that even injury, this is pretty much an immune response. We have a lot of cellular response mechanisms that come, and basically it's very similar to an immune response when you get a virus or bacterial infection. It's a lot of that same inflammatory immune system activity that we'll talk about. As we go through there, if the process does not resolve, then we get into this chronic inflammation that kind of stalls out a little bit. You do get this accumulation of what we call free radicals and other granulation tissue that just kind of sits there. And if it sits there too long, it starts to get fibrotic and degenerate a little bit. Hopefully we don't get to that point. From an acute aspect, these are the main outcomes that we kind of battle, right? And so we know that when we're doing our ice elevation and compression and doing all that, we're trying to combat some of this stuff that it's good, but we don't want a whole bunch of edema. We don't need to have a whole bunch of pain. We definitely don't want a hypoxic situation for very long, or an ischemic situation for very long. And yeah, we can't do anything about what the initial injury was, but that secondary death pathway, the metabolic death, if we can avoid that, then that helps us move out of that acute stage a lot quicker than not doing it. All right, so let's get to the good stuff. Chemical mediators, right? I've highlighted the three that we're going to really talk about. This is what the NSAIDs are, our non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. That's where they're going to target right there. Kinins, this is a plasma protein. This is all on, let me see where this was. This is 115, right? So you get page 115, talks about the kinin system, plasma proteins, that kind of stuff. You've heard of histamine and heparin, and we've talked about those as we go through that process. But we're really going to focus on these top three for this class and these things and how they come. And so if you, on that page 115, I'm going to direct your attention to figure 6-2, kind of a little schematic, pretty basic. But then as you start to look on page 115 in the text, there's that heading that says arachidonic acid metabolites. That sounds super fancy. So I have this figure. I think to me, I think this I like the schematic, image of it. I have this in your slides that I gave to you. But if you look under that heading that I just told you, that arachidonic acid metabolites, in that first paragraph, it talks about the accosinoids, and I've called this the Accosinoid Cascade, as you see this. And so I want to just walk you through real quick. This right here appears the cell membrane, and it's a bilipid layer, has the lipid, kind of a aspect to it. And inside that is this arachidonic acid. It just kind of chills in there, sits out. Injury releases that, and this phospholipase, just a random enzyme, basically kind of allows that to be released. And then when this arachidonic acid comes in contact with other, right down here, with other enzymes, cyclooxygenase and lipooxygenase, then we have all this other stuff that is created. Now I want to take a quick pause here and make sure that I'm identifying, because there is some stuff on here that looks really confusing when you start seeing PGI lowercase 2 and HTEs and whatever that word says, P450. No, don't worry about any of that. I'm going to highlight right now. What you need to know is the arachidonic acid right here is kind of contained in the cell membranes. Inflammatory or injury kind of stimuli, trauma, is going to release this phospholipase and arachidonic acid, and then that comes in contact with the COX-1, COX-2. You are going to have to know the LOX. Don't worry about this fatty acid pathway. Nobody cares about that. Some people do, but we don't. And then when you get into this down here, we're just going to categorize these as prostaglandins, because you've heard of those before. And all I'm worried about over here is leukotrienes. That's what we're going to be worried about. There's a number of different types of, that's what they call them, the prostanoids. There's a number of different types of prostaglandins. We're not going to worry about all these little numbers and letters and that kind of stuff. Just know prostaglandins and thromboxane, leukotrienes. That's what I want you guys to know. This next slide here, pretty similar, right? So it shows the same cell membrane, phospholipase. The inflammation kind of releases this arachidonic acid, and then as it comes in contact specifically with cyclooxygenase 1, cyclooxygenase 2, or COX-1, COX-2, you can see that there's different types of prostaglandins being produced. And so when you come down here, you see thromboxane, and then all we're going to do for our class is we're just going to call prostaglandins, just this big term of all that where it's going to encompass all these different E2, F2A alpha. We're not going to worry about that. So you also see on this one the intervention part, when we see, all right, how do we stop this process and what the NSAIDs do, and you can kind of see I've added those in there at what pathway, but we'll come back to that later. So all of this process that I just kind of walked through and took you through, and you have this little chart now, all of that is explained in your text, starting at 115. Again, it goes through up to 117, and again, it does get a little bit confusing sometimes if you read it. Hopefully this chart and this little Accosinoid right here, Cascade, will help you kind of, at least visualize and kind of get an idea of, this is the stuff we need to know. We need to know that basic Accosinoid Cascade, that arachidonic acid, if we have the right types of enzymes, COX-1 and COX-2, are going to lead to prostaglandins, thromboxane. All right. If I go back Let me go back. If I go back to this one, I'm going to add this extra one. There's this extra one that we'll talk about later because this is specific to the lungs and respiratory inflammation. But there's another, arachidonic acid is a precursor to these leukotrienes, which is really important in the lungs and lung inflammation as we go through. All right, so now comes the bullet points. Now we just get the idea of, all right, what does thromboxane do? And this is on that initial vasoconstriction and platelet and aggregation that we have. The prostaglandins are the one that we're going to spend the most of our time and attention on. And as you can see, if you look back at those charts, there's a whole bunch of different prostaglandins have a whole bunch of different effects and uses and areas that they have an interaction in the body. We're looking at, obviously the inflammatory specific ones, but there's a lot, right? So it can cause fever. It can cause uterine contractions. People in labor are, when labor needs to be induced, it's a prostaglandin type medicine that is given to induce uterine contractions or labor. I want you to pay attention to these two right here because that'll become important when we talk about the specific drugs. Prostaglandins, for the most part, in the inflammatory world, we want to kind of go, we want to minimize those. Yeah, we want them a little bit, but we want to try to minimize their effects until you get to these two, right? I don't think I want a whole bunch of extra acid secretions. And guess what? Mucus, an extra protective mucus in my stomach would be nice. So pay attention to those because those will become important. So you can see the rest of them that's on there from a prostaglandin standpoint, and make sure that you have an idea of what those are and how important those are, because our drugs that we use for anti-inflammatory is going to interrupt the formation of prostaglandins. The way that the drug companies and the pharmacology works to reduce prostaglandins is interrupting that Accosinoid Cascade that I showed you on that chart. And the way that we do that is we can come in here and say, we know we need these enzymes to create prostaglandins, and let's kind of like get rid of those. Let's inhibit those, and then we don't ever get prostaglandin formation. So that's where we have the COX-1 and COX-2. I do want you to pay attention to where the differences between COX-1 and COX-2, because those will be a little bit important when we start talking about the drug. So you have your COX-1, COX-2. COX-2 is the ones that are specific to the peripheral inflammatory kind of processes, and so it'd be nice to go, man, well, let's just inhibit those and we can have the other ones still going. That's a nice idea. It's a little bit harder in practice, as we'll see when we talk about the drugs. That extra pathway that I talked about on the leukotrienes that still comes from arachidonic acid, specific in the lungs, and you can kind of see it does some of the same things that prostaglandins do, has some of the same inflammatory processes, but it definitely has effects within the lungs. All right, so I think I'm gonna in this one right here on just the general kind of introduction to the inflammation process and what we're doing and kind of the processes that are there that our drugs are now going to intervene in. So we'll do part 2 in a second.